Your soulmate wrote a secret love letter for you, and you need to read it before tomorrow, because the person holding it has been instructed to destroy it if you do not claim it in time. The letter was never meant to frighten you or force you into an immediate decision. It was written months ago, hidden after your soulmate lost the courage to deliver it, and recently discovered inside a box containing the last pieces of the future they once imagined with you. Tomorrow, that box is being removed from their life forever. Before it disappears, someone who knows the complete story has decided that the words inside the letter belong to you. Your soulmate may never have intended for you to see it now, but the first sentence reveals why keeping it hidden any longer would allow you to continue believing a painful lie. The letter begins with the exact date when your connection changed. Until now, you may have believed that day marked the moment your soulmate became tired of you, chose another person, or decided that loving you required more effort than they were willing to give. Their behavior afterward seemed to confirm every painful interpretation. They became difficult to reach, answered your questions with incomplete sentences, and acted as though the emotional closeness between you had become something they wanted to forget. You responded by protecting yourself. What else could you have done when the person who once made you feel deeply seen suddenly behaved as though your presence had become uncomfortable? But, according to the letter, that day did not mark the disappearance of their feelings. It marked the moment those feelings became impossible for them to control. Your soulmate writes that they had planned to confess everything during your final honest conversation. Before meeting you, they spent hours rewriting the same sentences because they wanted to speak without hiding behind confusion. They intended to tell you that the connection had become more serious than they publicly admitted. They wanted to acknowledge that your desire for clarity was not pressure, and that their repeated hesitation had begun damaging something precious. They even planned to ask whether you would be willing to build the relationship slowly but intentionally, without allowing fear, distance, or other people's opinions to continue deciding what happened. The confession never reached you, because moments before the conversation, your soulmate received information that changed their emotional state completely. Someone close to them claimed that you had already decided to leave. They said you were speaking with another person, preparing to close the connection, and planning to ask one final question only, so you could leave without guilt. The story was not completely invented. You had spoken with someone about the pain you were carrying. You had admitted that continuing without clarity was becoming impossible. But the meaning of your words was changed. Your exhaustion was presented as betrayal, and your need for a boundary was described as proof that another person had already replaced your soulmate. Your soulmate arrived, believing the ending had already been chosen. Every question you asked sounded different through that fear. When you asked what they truly wanted, they heard a test they were destined to fail. When you explained that uncertainty was hurting you, they assumed you were preparing to justify leaving. When you asked whether there was still a future worth discussing, they believed you had already decided there was not. Rather than risk confessing their feelings, and hearing that they were too late, they protected themselves with distance. The letter admits that this was one of the greatest mistakes they ever made. They watched your face while giving vague answers and saw the disappointment they were creating, yet they remained silent. Part of them hoped you would recognize the fear beneath their behavior and reassure them, without being asked, They wanted you to prove the story they had heard was false while refusing to tell you the story existed. You were expected to answer an accusation you had never received. When you finally became quiet, your soulmate interpreted that silence as confirmation that someone else had been right about you. You interpreted their silence as confirmation that you had never been chosen. Both of you left carrying opposite versions of the same heartbreak. The second page of the letter explains what happened immediately after you walked away. Your soulmate remained in the room, street, car, or quiet place where the conversation ended. They expected relief, because they had avoided vulnerability, but relief never arrived. Instead, they felt the full weight of everything they had refused to say. They remembered the prepared confession waiting in their pocket or saved inside their phone. They opened it, read the words, and realized the courage required to write them had disappeared at the exact moment. Courage was needed. They nearly followed you. According to the letter, they stood up, moved toward the door, and imagined calling your name. They wanted to say that the coldness you had just experienced was not the truth. They wanted to explain that another person's words had frightened them, and that they had allowed suspicion to speak before giving your character a fair chance. But pride whispered that if you truly cared, you would return first. Fear warned that following you would make them appear desperate. Shame said they had already ruined the moment and would only make themselves look more foolish by attempting to repair it. They remained where they were. That decision created the silence that followed. Your soulmate believed the distance would last a few days. They assumed you would send a message, asking whether they had reconsidered. You had reopened conversations before, forgiven hesitation, and shown patience whenever they struggled to express themselves. Your love had become so dependable that they confused dependability with permanence. They did not understand that every return had cost you something. Each time you reached out after being hurt, you were using emotional strength your soulmate rarely recognized. This time, you had reached the end of that strength. The letter describes how your soulmate checked their phone constantly during the first week. Every notification created a physical reaction. They imagined your name appearing with the words they were too afraid to send. When the message did not arrive, they became defensive. They told themselves your silence proved that your feelings had never been as deep as theirs. This explanation hurt, but it allowed them to avoid the more difficult possibility. Perhaps you had loved them deeply, and finally understood that love could not continue surviving through your effort alone. A mutual friend eventually told them that you were not angry. You were exhausted. This distinction changed something inside your soulmate, but not enough to make them act immediately. They asked what you had said. The friend explained that you did not insult them or expose private details. You simply admitted that you could no longer continue trying to interpret feelings someone refused to express clearly. You said the connection had become a place where every beautiful moment created hope, and every silence punished you for believing in that hope. Your soulmate expected you to describe them as cruel. Instead, you described them as afraid. You said you believed they cared, but caring privately had stopped being enough. You could not build a future around emotions that appeared only when your soulmate felt safe and disappeared whenever honesty became necessary. You understood that their old wounds made closeness difficult, yet you were finally learning that understanding someone's pain did not require volunteering to remain injured by it. These words appear inside the letter exactly as the mutual friend repeated them. Your soulmate writes that your compassion made the loss more painful. It would have been easier if you had hated them. Hatred could have allowed them to dismiss you as dramatic or unreasonable. But your refusal to attack them removed that protection. You saw the fear behind their behavior and still chose to step away. Your boundary was not built from misunderstanding. It was built from understanding too much. The third page contains a confession your soulmate never shared with anyone. After the separation, they attempted to create the appearance that they had moved forward. They became more social, allowed photographs to be taken with people they barely knew, and responded casually whenever your name entered conversation. They wanted friends to believe the connection had not affected them. More importantly, they wanted to convince themselves. But every performance ended when they were alone. At night, they returned to your old messages. They searched for the moment your tone changed and tried to identify the exact sentence where hope disappeared. They replayed voice notes, reread jokes, and studied ordinary conversations that had felt insignificant when they were happening. Your soulmate had once believed that dramatic moments created love. In your absence, they discovered how deeply love had lived inside the smallest details. They missed the way you noticed emotional changes before they were explained. They missed how you listened, without immediately turning their vulnerability into advice. They missed the questions you asked, even the ones that once frightened them, because those questions proved you were interested in knowing the person behind the performance. They missed the safety they had treated as pressure, simply because safety required honesty. The letter says they began writing to you every night. These writings were not messages they intended to send. They were fragments, apologies, memories, and imagined conversations. Some began with your name and ended after one sentence because guilt made continuing impossible. Others became several pages long. Your soulmate wrote about what they should have said, what they believed you deserved, and what they feared your life might become without them. The secret love letter you are being asked to read was the longest of those writings. It was written after your soulmate learned the original information about you had been false. The person who first claimed you were preparing to choose someone else finally admitted that they had exaggerated what they heard. They had seen your connection becoming more serious and feared losing their position in your soulmate's life. This person may have been an ex, a possessive friend, or someone whose emotional importance depended upon your soulmate remaining uncertain. They did not necessarily invent another romantic relationship, but they presented harmless details in the most suspicious way possible. They said you were talking to someone, without explaining that the person was a friend, helping you process the confusion. They said you were ready to leave, without mentioning that you still hoped one honest conversation could change your decision. They said you were tired of waiting, as though this meant your love had disappeared, when it actually meant your love had become painful to carry alone. Your soulmate demanded to know why the truth had been distorted. The answer was jealousy. The person believed that if your relationship became secure, your soulmate would no longer depend on them for constant emotional interpretation. They had become accustomed to being consulted whenever your soulmate felt afraid. Your connection encouraged direct communication, which threatened their influence. They wanted your soulmate to remain confused enough to need them. The confession filled your soul with anger, but the letter does not place every responsibility on that person. Your soulmate writes that the lie succeeded because it gave fear the explanation fear wanted. Believing you were preparing to leave allowed them to avoid openly choosing you. If you had already decided the ending, they could retreat without admitting that their own hesitation was the greater danger. The lie was placed in their hands. They chose to hold it more tightly than the evidence of your character. The moment your soulmate discovered this, they attempted to contact you. They opened your conversation, typed several versions of an apology, and deleted each one. One message began by exposing the person who had misled them. Another focused on how devastated they felt. A third begged you to meet immediately because they could not tolerate another day of silence. None of those messages felt fair. Blaming the outside person would have ignored the fact that your soulmate chose not to ask you directly. Describing their own pain would have placed another emotional burden upon you. Begging for immediate contact would have repeated the pattern where their fear determined the schedule your heart was expected to follow. Instead, they began writing the letter. The first paragraph says, "I believed a story about you, because the story protected me from admitting how much I wanted you. You gave me your character, your patience, and repeated opportunities for honesty. I gave more authority to one frightened rumor than to everything you consistently showed me. I am sorry." The letter continues by describing the future they had imagined but never revealed. Your soulmate had pictured a life that was not dramatic or perfect. They imagined ordinary mornings, conversations during long drives, disagreements handled without disappearing, and the comfort of knowing that neither person had to guess whether the other would remain. They imagined you meeting people important to them without being introduced as someone insignificant. They imagined supporting your goals, celebrating your progress, and creating traditions that would belong only to both of you. They were not afraid because the future seemed impossible. They were afraid because it felt possible. Before meeting you, your soulmate could leave most relationships emotionally, before those relationships had the opportunity to leave them. They could keep one part of themselves unavailable, and call that independence. Your presence challenged this protection. You did not demand access to every private wound, but you created enough safety that they began wanting to become visible. Wanting visibility made them vulnerable to the possibility of being known and rejected. They reacted by hiding more. The letter apologizes for the contradictions you experienced. Your soulmate admits that they often became cold after the warmest moments, because closeness made them afraid of how much they could lose. They pulled away after vulnerable conversations because they needed to feel in control again. When you responded to the withdrawal with questions, they interpreted those questions as pressure, even though their inconsistency had created the uncertainty. They recognize that hidden fear may explain behavior, but it does not erase the impact. You experienced rejection, no matter what love remained inside them. The fourth page describes the day your soulmate saw you after the separation. Perhaps you were walking with someone, attending an event, or simply appearing more peaceful than they expected. They had imagined that your absence from their life meant you were suffering, visibly. Seeing you smile created an unexpected mixture of relief and panic. They were relieved because your life had not been destroyed. They were terrified because your life no longer appeared to need their return. Your soulmate admits that part of them wanted you to remain emotionally available, even while they gave you no reason to wait. They wanted the reassurance of your love, without accepting the responsibility of building something safe around it. Your healing exposed the selfishness of that expectation. You were not moving forward to punish them. You were surviving what their silence forced you to accept. The letter explains that they began considering whether delivering the confession would support your healing or interrupt it. Every desire to reach out contained two motivations. One was genuine accountability. The other was panic at the possibility of becoming permanently irrelevant to your future. Your soulmate did not trust themselves to separate those motivations completely. They decided to hide the letter until they could approach, without demanding anything in return. Months passed. During that time, they made changes they describe in detail. They stopped asking other people to interpret your behavior. They began communicating directly in friendships and family relationships, instead of allowing discomfort to become silence. They created distance from people who encouraged suspicion and emotional dependence. They started confronting the old experiences that taught them love was safest when kept uncertain. They do not claim these changes made them perfect. They say, the changes taught them that an apology should not become a performance designed to regain access. Real growth continues even when forgiveness is uncertain. If they became honest, only because honesty might bring you back, the old fear would return the moment reassurance arrived. The letter contains a sentence underlined twice. You should never have to become the reward for work I was already responsible for doing. Your soulmate writes that they still wanted to deliver the letter, but each passing month made them question whether they had lost the right. They imagined your possible responses. You might feel relief knowing the truth. You might become angry that the confession had remained hidden while you questioned your value. You might already be building something meaningful with another person. You might read every word, believe it, and still decide that reopening the connection would threaten the peace you created. They accepted that all these responses would be valid. This acceptance is why the letter was placed inside the box, instead of delivered immediately. The box contains other items connected to you. There may be a photograph they never displayed publicly, a small gift purchased but never given, a copy of a song list, or notes about places you once hoped to visit together. Your soulmate kept these things, because throwing them away felt like denying that the connection had changed them. But keeping them indefinitely also allowed them to remain emotionally attached to an unfinished story without taking responsibility. Recently, they decided the box could no longer remain hidden. Tomorrow they are moving, leaving an old home, closing a storage space, or completing another transition that requires them to decide what belongs in the future. The box was supposed to be destroyed or left behind. A trusted person helping with the transition discovered the letter and asked whether you had ever read it. Your soulmate said no. The person asked whether you knew the truth contained inside it. Again, the answer was no. They challenged your soulmate to consider whether destroying the letter would protect your peace, or merely protect them from the discomfort of being accountable. Your soulmate could not answer immediately. They had spent months saying they were respecting your healing, but part of that silence still served fear. As long as the letter remained hidden, they never had to discover whether you would reject the person they were becoming. The trusted person offered a solution. They would hold the letter until tomorrow. You would receive one opportunity to claim and read it without any expectation of responding. If you chose not to read it, the letter would be destroyed as originally planned. Your soulmate would accept your silence and stop allowing the hidden confession to occupy an invisible place between you. That is why you must read it before tomorrow. Not because something dangerous will happen. Not because love disappears at midnight. The deadline exists because the letter cannot remain an eternal hiding place. Either the truth reaches you, or your soulmate finally releases the fantasy that one perfect confession can preserve the possibility of a future forever. The final pages contain what may be the most shocking revelation. Your soulmate writes that shortly before the connection ended, you had secretly been chosen. They had spoken with someone they trusted about making the relationship official, introducing you properly, or taking a meaningful step that would show their intentions. They had begun rearranging a responsibility, rejecting another expectation, or preparing to set a boundary with someone who opposed the connection. You never saw these actions, because fear interrupted them, before they became visible. The person who misled your soulmate learned about this plan. That is when the story about you choosing someone else appeared. The timing was not accidental. Someone understood that once your soulmate acted openly, their influence would diminish. They created enough doubt to delay the decision. Your soulmate believed the story, withdrew from you, and then interpreted your resulting pain as proof that the warning had been correct. The letter says, "You thought I never chose you. The truth is that I chose you privately, and then became too afraid to let the choice become real. A choice hidden from the person it affects is not enough. You experienced only my hesitation, and you had every right to believe that hesitation was my answer." This admission hurts, because it confirms that the future you wanted came close to existing. But the letter refuses to romanticize the failure. Your soulmate understands that secret intentions do not create a relationship. You could not build upon decisions never communicated. Private love may be emotionally sincere, but when it repeatedly produces public uncertainty, the person receiving it experiences absence. Your soulmate does not ask you to return because they almost chose you. They apologize because almost kept you waiting for something you had no reason to trust. The next paragraph is written differently from the rest. The sentences are shorter, and the handwriting becomes less controlled. Your soulmate appears to have written this section while crying. They say, "I need you to know that I did not forget you. But I also need you to know that remembering you did not make the way I treated you acceptable. I carried love and behaved from fear. You carried love and eventually behaved from self-respect. I used to think you were the one who gave up. Now I understand. You were the one who finally stopped allowing both of us to remain inside a pattern that was slowly damaging you. They thank you for leaving without cruelty. They thank you for protecting private truths, even after they failed to protect the connection. They thank you for teaching them that love is not proven by endless tolerance." The letter admits that losing you revealed a painful difference between being loved and being capable of receiving love. Your soulmate had been loved. You offered patience, honesty, loyalty, and opportunities for direct conversation. But receiving those things required them to believe they were worthy of safety and capable of sustaining it. Their old wounds told them that stable love would eventually expose their inadequacy. They destroyed stability before stability could test that belief. This realization does not erase your pain, but it corrects the lie you may have carried. You were not rejected because you lacked value. You were encountered by someone whose fear was stronger than their ability to live according to what they felt. The letter also contains a boundary for your soulmate. They promise that if you choose not to respond, they will not send repeated messages, recruit friends to contact you, or treat your silence as revenge. They will not create another emergency or use the approaching deadline to pressure you. The truth belongs to you. Your future does not. If you respond only to acknowledge the letter, they will respect that. If you request a conversation, they will arrive without assuming the conversation means reconciliation. If you say the chapter is closed, they will accept that honesty does not remove consequences. This may be the strongest evidence of change, because the version of your soulmate you once knew struggled to allow your reactions to belong fully to you. When you became quiet, they interpreted the silence through their fear. When you created boundaries, they experienced them as punishment. When you asked for time, they worried time meant abandonment. The letter says, they are learning that love without freedom becomes another form of control. They no longer want your return if returning requires you to ignore what your healing taught you. They want the possibility, only if both people can create something different. Your soulmate describes what different would require. It would require direct answers instead of emotional guessing. It would require concerns being brought to each other before outsiders are invited to interpret them. It would require consistent actions after emotional confessions. It would require both people to speak when fear appears, rather than allowing silence to become a hidden decision. They also acknowledge that wanting this future does not prove they are ready for it. Readiness must be demonstrated over time. The letter does not promise that one apology will transform every old pattern. It says they are prepared to accept a slow process if you ever choose to explore another possibility. They understand that trust cannot be rebuilt through intensity. It returns through ordinary consistency. Messages answered honestly, plans respected, difficult conversations completed, and affection that does not disappear after closeness. But they also state that you should not wait while they become ready. Your life must continue. If another person offers the healthy love they failed to provide, they cannot ask you to reject that possibility because of a secret letter delivered late. They admit that this is one of the hardest sentences to write, but respecting you means recognizing that your happiness is not something they own. The letter's final page is addressed not to the version of you who may still love them, but to the version who once blamed themselves. Your soulmate writes that you were never too sensitive for noticing the changes in their behavior. You were not imagining the distance. You were not unreasonable for wanting words and actions to match. You did not destroy the relationship by asking questions. The questions exposed a truth they were not ready to face. You were not difficult to choose. They were afraid to become the person capable of choosing honestly. You were not abandoned because another person was more valuable. Your soulmate abandoned their own courage before the connection had a fair chance. You were not wrong for leaving. Remaining would have required you to continue accepting love as a hidden feeling rather than a dependable experience. The final confession says, I wrote this letter because I could not bear the thought that my silence might become the voice you use against yourself. Whenever you wonder whether you mattered, remember that I built an entire future inside my mind and then lost it because I was too afraid to place it in your hands. That failure belongs to me. It was never evidence that you were unworthy. Your soulmate then asks for forgiveness, but not in exchange for another chance. They ask forgiveness because remorse needs to be spoken to the person harmed. They say they forgive you for leaving, even though they now understand there was nothing to forgive. They forgive the version of themselves who acted from fear, but they refuse to excuse that version or allow it to control another relationship. The letter ends with a simple invitation. If there is still a peaceful part of you that wants one honest conversation, send only the word received. I will understand that it means you read the truth. Not that you have promised me a future. If silence is your answer, I will respect it, and let the letter become the final truth between us. This invitation matters, because it removes the dramatic decision your soulmate once placed upon every interaction. You do not need to say whether you still love them. You do not need to forgive immediately. You do not need to decide whether the future contains reunion or closure. You need only decide whether reading the truth serves your peace. Before tomorrow, the letter will either reach your hands, or disappear with the box. The physical pages may be destroyed, but the deeper choice remains yours. You can learn what was hidden and still keep every boundary. You can understand the past without returning to it. You can acknowledge that the love was real, without pretending the relationship was healthy. Do not allow the deadline to turn reflection into panic. A sincere confession remains sincere even when you need time after reading it. Your soulmate's courage does not create an emergency inside your heart. They waited too long, and the approaching deadline belongs to the consequences of that waiting. Read carefully, notice whether the letter accepts responsibility or merely explains fear. Notice whether it respects your freedom or attempts to use emotion as pressure. Notice whether the changes described exist beyond words. The letter may be beautiful, but a beautiful confession is only the beginning of evidence. Perhaps reading it will awaken hope. Let hope walk slowly. Perhaps it will bring anger. Let anger reveal where your boundaries were violated. Perhaps it will create relief because you finally understand that your intuition was not foolish. Let relief release self-blame rather than erase discernment. You may decide to send the single word requested. You may write a longer response. You may remain silent. Every choice is valid because the letter returns information, not ownership. If a conversation happens, your soulmate must be prepared to listen. They should not spend the entire meeting explaining why fear controlled them. They must hear what their behavior did to you. They must allow you to describe the nights of confusion, the ways you reduced your needs, and the moment you realized that waiting had become harmful. A person who has genuinely changed will not call this punishment. They will understand it as the truth required for any honest future. If no conversation happens, the letter can still become an ending more compassionate than the silence you previously received. It confirms that your love was seen. It explains that the connection did not collapse because you were impossible to value. Most importantly, it reminds you that another person's hidden feelings were never sufficient reason for you to remain in uncertainty. Comment: I receive truth without abandoning myself. If you are ready to release the painful belief that you were not enough, like this video. If you believe love should be expressed, while both hearts still have the opportunity to build something honest, and subscribe for more messages that remind you that your worth never depends upon how quickly another person finds the courage to recognize it. Your soulmate wrote a secret love letter, and tomorrow the physical pages may disappear. But the strongest truth inside it should remain. They did not lose you because your love was weak. They lost you because your love became strong enough to stop accepting fear as an answer.